Now, don't insult the witness. Um, um, so before we begin with Mr. Jacoby, Ms. Shaheen, would you please give us some plan or outline for NMOGA's witnesses going forward?
Check. There we go. I can tell you what it was this morning, but now that Dr. Vingosh took as much time as he did, I'm not sure how it will go forward. We were planning on having Mr. McCurdy testify after Mr. Jacoby today. That might not happen. And then, so I'm not sure who will go on in the morning, whether it will be Mr. McCurdy or Mr. D'Antonio. But Dr. Balch is available after 11 tomorrow.
Thank you very much for sharing all of that. Of course. All righty. I'm sorry, Mr. Dodd.
I'm just not sure when is Dr. Tischler going?
Oh,
like the reason I bring this up, Madam Hearing Officer, is just because I was given I'm sorry. The reason I bring this up is I was given a completely different order of witnesses yesterday with Mr. Jacoby going second to last.
I understand there's been movement.
And I'm just trying to get a firm, we're in their case now, and I'm just trying to get a firm sort of commitment. This will be the order so that I can adequately ensure that we've got everything ready.
Okay. Do you have something about Mr. Tischler?
I believe Mr. Tischler will go last, but I cannot make a firm commitment as to anyone at this time.
Okay, thank you. So, sir, if you would please spell your first and last name for the transcript.
My first name is Lawrence, Lawrence, and my last name is Jacoby, Jacobi.
Thank you. And do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shaheen.
Thank you. Mr. Jacoby, what is your current employment?
My current employment is I'm an independent consultant, and my company name is Jacoby Consulting.
And what is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's and master's degrees in nuclear engineering from Texas A&M University and a law degree from the South Texas College of Law.
Can you please briefly describe your work background?
Yes, during my graduate studies, I worked as a health physicist at the Cyclotron Institute at Texas A&M. Thereafter, I joined Houston Lighting and Power Company as a health physicist and was later promoted to supervising engineer for nuclear safety and licensing. Yes, ma'am. Is that better? Too much? Okay. As I was saying, when I joined Houston Lighting and Power Company as a health physicist, I was later promoted to supervising engineer for nuclear safety and licensing during the construction of the South Texas Project nuclear power plant. In 1982, I became the general manager of the Texas Low-Level Radioactive Waste Disposal Authority, which was organized to site a disposal site for low-level radioactive waste in Texas. In 1998, I was recruited to join EnviroCare of Texas as Vice President and General Counsel. EnviroCare of Texas was an extension of EnviroCare of Utah, a radioactive waste processing and disposal company. I decided to start my own company in 2001.
And we've attached your CV as NMOGA Exhibit 14, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you provided rebuttal testimony on behalf of NMOGA in this matter, right?
Yes,
And this was submitted as NMOGA Exhibit 12, correct?
yes, that's correct.
And do you have that testimony before you now?
I do.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
Yes, I have one correction. On page 11, at line 209, the question there should refer to the testimony of Mr. Gom and not that of Dr. Hu.
Otherwise, is that testimony accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes, it is.
And you adopt that testimony today?
I do.
Let's walk through a summary of your testimony now. I have your PowerPoint up on the screen. What is the purpose of your rebuttal testimony today?
The purpose of my rebuttal testimony is to rebut the testimony of Dr. Christopher Lewis, Mr. Norman Gom, Ms. Kathleen Murphy, Dr. Lee Hu, Justin Noble, and Dr. Abner Vingosh.
And have you reviewed the testimony of these folks in preparation for developing your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I have.
Have you also reviewed the proposed rule as revised by the Environment Department?
Yes, I have.
Turning back to your education and work experience for a minute, can you describe that experience that pertains directly to the subject of your testimony today?
Yes, I have a nuclear industry executive with 45 years of what I call frontline experience. I have a Bachelor of Science and an engineering degree in nuclear engineering from Texas A&M, as I said earlier. As a nuclear engineer and attorney, I provide hands-on technical assistance for licensing, construction, operation, and decommissioning of nuclear and radiological facilities. I provide also consultation on various issues related to radioactive material, including the issue of naturally occurring radioactive material in oil and gas operations.
And you also worked as a health physicist. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And where was that?
I started out as doing health physics work at the Cyclotron Institute at Texas A&M. Pardon me. I'm sorry. I couldn't understand you. What I was saying is I started out as a health physicist at the Cyclotron Institute at Texas A&M. And when I joined Houston Lighting and Power Company, I joined as a health physicist and was later promoted to supervising engineer of nuclear safety and licensing.
And what were your responsibilities during that time?
My responsibilities as a supervising engineer for licensing was I was responsible for the preparation and maintenance of the final safety analysis report and environmental reports for the South Texas Project Nuclear Generating Station. And that job included communication with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other state and federal agencies.
And did these tasks relate to ensuring proper disposal of waste containing radioactive materials in order to protect human health and the environment?
Yes,
And thereafter, you went to the Texas Low-Level Waste Disposal Authority, and you were there for 17 years. Is that right?
that's correct. I left the agency after 16 and a half years, actually.
And what were your responsibilities during that time?
I was the chief operating officer of the agency, responsible for all operations of the authority, subject only to the orders of the board of directors.
And did this responsibility relate to ensuring proper disposal of waste containing radioactive materials in order to protect human health and the environment?
Yes, it did.
And you worked at EnviroCare, I believe you said, after you left the disposal authority. Is that right?
That's correct. I left the authority in 1998 and joined EnviroCare of Texas as the vice president of operations and general counsel.
And what were your pertinent responsibilities at EnviroCare?
I was responsible for development and licensing of a facility for the processing and disposal of low-level radioactive waste in Texas.
And since then, in your capacity as an independent consultant, what type of expert assistance do you provide to your clients?
I actually provide a wide amount of assistance to my clients, including assistance on the management and disposal of radioactive waste.
My apologies, I forgot to forward the slides. You start here by providing some background on the type of radioactive material pertinent here. What is that material?
The type of radioactive material pertinent today is naturally occurring radioactive material, frequently called by the acronym NORM.
And what particular element are we talking about?
The element that is pertinent to this hearing is radium-226, which is naturally occurring radioactive material. It's a daughter product of the decay of uranium-238. Radium is soluble in water and occasionally a contaminant of water, produced during oil and gas operations.
Are there regulations relating to radium?
Yes, the New Mexico regulations at section 20.3.4.461 set the effluent concentration limits for radium at 60 picocuries per liter, and a monthly average release to sewers set at 600 picocuries per liter. The concentration limit for soil is 5 picocuries per gram, and the concentration limit for drinking water is 5 picocuries per liter. According to New Mexico regulation 20.3.14.1403, produced water from oil and gas operations is exempt from regulation if it is disposed in a class 1 or class 2 well or in a double-sided surface impoundment.
And what is NMOGA's position on radionuclides in produced water?
NMOGA opposes a prohibition on discharge of treated produced water to surface water or groundwater because the radionuclides in produced water can be readily treated with existing technologies that render the water suitable for discharge.
What about untreated water?
Under the current discharge limits for radium-226 as set out in the New Mexico Code, produced water that has less than 60 picocuries per liter of radium is safe for discharge. It would not need to be treated to remove radionuclides.
Nonetheless, NMOGA is not recommending that untreated water is appropriate for discharge, is it?
No.
What are the existing treatment technologies for radionuclides?
There's a number of treatment technologies to remove radionuclides from water. They include filtration, reverse osmosis, ion exchange, or vapor treatment.
And how do these treatment technologies affect radium in produced water, and how are resulting waste disposed of?
These technologies can remove 90 to 99% of radium in processed water. The treated water would be suitable for discharge to surface water or groundwater. The resulting wastewater can be injected into an underground formation, and the solid waste can be sent to a suitable facility for disposal.
Let's start with your review of Dr. Lewis's direct testimony. What is Dr. Lewis's position?
Dr. Lewis supports a regulatory prohibition on the discharge of untreated or treated produced water to surface water or groundwater.
And what is NMOGA's response to Dr. Lewis's position?
NMOGA's position is the NME ED should amend the proposed Rule 8 to allow the discharge of treated produced water to surface water or groundwater.
You've also offered testimony in rebuttal to that of the Environment Department's witness, Kathleen Murphy. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And what is Ms. Murphy's testimony in this regard?
Ms. Murphy alleges that the USGS produced water database has little data on radionuclides in produced water.
And what is NMOGA's response to Ms. Murphy's testimony?
It would be unfortunate to conclude that norm in produced water is a significant problem without considering all the available data to better understand the concentration of radium in produced water and how those concentrations can be adjusted by various treatment methods.
And in your testimony, you point out a paper that Ms. Murphy omitted in her testimony
Yes,
and the accompanying data set, correct?
yes.
And what paper is that?
It's a NMOGA Exhibit 117. It's a paper by Zhang et al. Entitled Datasets Associated with the Characterization of Produced Water in Pecos River Water in the Permian Basin, the United States. The paper includes data on radionuclides in the Permian Basin.
And have you reviewed that paper?
Yes.
Can you summarize the paper's contents as they're pertinent to your rebuttal of Ms. Murphy's testimony?
Yes, the paper includes data sets specifically associated with the characterization of produced water in the Permian Basin.
You've also offered testimony in response to that of Mr. Gom as well, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And what does Mr. Gom testify about?
Mr. Gom contests the adequacy of the Rio Puerco desalinization study He believes that highly elevated levels of radium will be produced and questions the expense of NORM disposal. He alleges that the New Mexico Produced Water Resource Consortium, I believe it is, has data on NORM that has not been made public.
What does the preliminary engineering report state in this regard?
So the preliminary engineering report for the Rio Puerco desalination study states the removal efficiency for radium will be more than 99%, reducing the gross alpha and radium isotopes from as high as 84 picocuries per liter to below 1/2 picocurie per liter.
And what about the Rio Puerco desal water studies report?
The Rio Puerco desalination water studies report states radioactive removal range from 50 to 99%. The report also notes the combined treatment processes are effective at reducing radionuclides to well below the drinking water limit of 5 picocuries per liter.
And what is NMOGA's response to Mr. Gom's testimony?
Known treatment technologies and waste disposal options are more than adequate to remove NORM and return produced water to acceptable limits. The proposed rule should be modified to permit the discharge of produced water after treatment.
You've also offered testimony in response to that of Dr. Lei Hu, correct?
Yes.
And what does Dr. Hu state about radium in produced water?
Dr. Liu states the total radium concentration in produced water from the Permian Basin is approximately 469 picocuries per liter, which exceeds the EPA drinking water limit of 5 picocuries per liter. She suggests further analyses and studies are necessary to completely understand the detriments associated with produced water, including waste disposal.
And what is NMOGA's position in regard to Dr. Hu's testimony?
Mr. Gom and Dr. Hu both acknowledge that known treatment methods like softening followed by reverse osmosis can remove virtually all radioactive material from produced water, rendering it below regulatory levels and making it available for discharge.
You also reviewed the testimony of Justin Noble, is that right?
Yes.
What was your general observations about Mr. Noble's testimony?
Mr. Noble's conclusions are based on anecdotal studies with non-technical individuals, retold from a biased viewpoint, and I believe lacking in scientific basis.
And more specifically, what does Mr. Noble testify to?
Mr. Noble makes 8 points in his testimony at pages 2 and 3. He provides 7 reasons for his opposition to the rule, which appear to be summarized in his point number 8.
And what is Mr. Noble's first reason?
Mr. Noble asserts the oil and gas industry has documented an urgent warning on the treatment and reuse of the reuse processes proposed.
And what is your response to Mr. Noble's first reason?
The reports cited for this allegation are 30 to 40-year-old reports, noting that there is a concern about NORM.
And has there been additional work since then done by the industry to identify and treat potential hazards relating to NORM?
Yes.
Ms. Shaheen and Mr. Jacoby, the interpreters are challenged by the speed. So if you would just slow down a little bit, and with your normal speaking voice, you're not going fast, but when you read, you are.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms.
I apologize. May take a drink of water, maybe that'll fix things.
Thank you.
Have you reviewed Exhibit 5, which Mr. Noble relies on?
Yes, I have.
And what is the conclusion in Exhibit 5?
The authors conclude that there is limited potential for radiation exposures to the public and workers from oil and gas development. The resulting exposures are well below the natural background dose of 3.1 millisieverts and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's effective dose limit of 1 millisievert to the public.
What is Mr. Noble's second reason for his opposition to allowing reuse of produced water?
Mr. Noble asserts that produced water processing facilities in West Virginia are as radioactive as Chernobyl.
And what is your response to Mr. Noble's reason two?
That's an exaggeration that is completely untrue. There's no reasonable comparison between the quantity of radioactive material associated with produced water and that associated with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Moreover, Mr. Noble asserts the background at the facility was 5,000 times background, but the highest radiation level at the West Virginia processing facility was measured at 3 millirem per hour. Annual background radiation in the United States is 610 millirem, which is 0.07 millirem per hour.
What are the actual facts related to this particular incident?
The totality of norm produced by the oil and gas industry in the United States doesn't come anywhere close to the amount of radioactivity that was released from the Chernobyl explosion.
What is the third reason that Mr. Noble states in support of his opposition?
Mr. Noble states or asserts that permissive rules allow the oil and gas industry to create questionable products out of oil field waste, including de-icer in the northern United States.
And what is your response to Mr. Noble's reason number three?
There was some concern about using salt-laden produced water as a de-icer on roads in the northern U.S. However, an analysis conducted by the Ohio Radiation Control Bureau showed the dose to an exposed individual to be less than the allowable annual public dose of 100 millirem per year.
And what is the status of that product now?
In an abundance of caution, the Ohio Radiation Control Bureau has suspended the use of produced water as a de-icer, but the product may still be purchased at selected locations.
What is Mr. Noble's reason number four?
Mr. Noble asserts that consumption of radium-tainted drinking water has resulted in increased cases of childhood sarcoma.
And what is your response to his reason number four?
Most medical doctors agree that minimal ingestion of radium is not a precursor to Ewing sarcoma.
And does the American Cancer, is there any, excuse me, let me back up. Is there any support for Mr. Noble's assertion regarding Ewing sarcoma?
The American Cancer Society has stated there is no known lifestyle-related or environmental cause of Ewing's tumors. Mr. Noble concedes that doctors have not identified any risk factor for Ewing sarcoma.
What is the fifth reason that Mr. Noble objects to this rule?
Mr. Noble asserts the dangers of flowback and its impact on oil field workers is still largely unexamined. He bases this on anecdotal conversations with oil field workers that have alleged illness or medical issues related to their employment in the oil business.
And what is your response to Mr. Noble's fifth reason?
Mr. Noble doesn't check with oil field experts or medical professionals to validate the anecdotal stories he related in his book.
Is pertinent training provided for workers in the oil and gas industry?
Yes, petroleum companies require strict adherence to safety procedures. Most have an environmental health and safety officer whose sole job is to oversee safety in the workplace. Oil companies further require at least a 4-hour norm training course and a 3-hour transportation safety course.
And what is Mr. Noble's reason number six for his opposition to discharge of treated produced water?
Mr. Noble's reason number six is that uranium mill tailings are contaminating land and contributing to contamination of infant formula drawn from cow's milk.
And what is your response to Mr. Noble's reason number six?
There's three considerations. Produced water wells and impoundments are not at all similar to large tailings piles from uranium mines and mills. Today, all uranium mining in the U.S. is done by in situ leaching. The production area is confined to a well field. There's no tailings to blow around in the wind. norm is not in any way similar to that described as described. As in leach mining, oil and gas norm is not similar to a large uranium mill tailings pile.
And Mr. Noble's reason number 7.
Mr. Noble asserts saltwater disposal wells rely on outdated, scientifically unfounded, and dangerous disposal techniques.
And do you have a response to his testimony about saltwater disposal wells?
Well, I don't believe saltwater disposal wells are an issue in this proceeding. It's my understanding that in New Mexico, saltwater disposal wells are regulated by the Oil Conservation Division.
Can you summarize your understanding of Mr. Noble's testimony regarding his point 8?
So my impression of Mr. Noble's testimony in point 8 was to summarize his opinion that reduced water leads to contamination of waterways and generates a litany of environmental and health issues for New Mexico. Mexicans, excuse me.
And what is your response to number 8?
So as set out in my testimony, I believe Mr. Noble's conclusions are unfounded. Naturally occurring radioactive material in produced water, when properly treated, may be handled in a manner that is not detrimental to the health and safety of New Mexicans. There are known and tested treatment technologies that can render produced water suitable for discharge to the environment. Moreover, New Mexico has strict requirements for managing norm resulting from oil and gas production.
Does the state currently regulate naturally occurring radioactive material in the oil and gas industry?
Yes, they do. Those rules are set out in 20.3.14 New Mexico Administrative Code entitled Naturally Occurring Radioactive Materials in the Oil and Gas Industry.
Will you also be presenting rebuttal testimony today?
Yes,
Did you review the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Van Gosh?
I did. Yes.
And what is your understanding of Dr. Van Gosh's testimony regarding radioactive material in produced water?
Dr. Van Gosh is not opposed to the discharge of produced water, provided it's treated adequately using existing and adequate technologies to remove radium.
And what is your response?
I concur with Dr. Van Gosh. To the extent that produced water is properly treated, there's no reason that it cannot be used for other purposes.
Have you also reviewed the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Gom and Ms. Murphy?
Yes, I have. In particular, I reviewed his written rebuttal testimony on page 4, lines 11 through 13.
And what is your understanding of Mr. Gom's testimony there?
Mr. Gom states that radium-226 and 228 are not measured or associated using reliable data because operators consider their fluid, oil, and gas water contaminants data to be trade secrets.
And what is your response to that testimony?
While some constituents in frac fluids might be trade secrets, the presence of radium and other radionuclides is not. With respect to the occurrence of naturally occurring radioactive material in oil and gas production, there are a number of recent studies presented in the Health Physics Journal that address specifically norm in oil and gas exploration and production. Additionally, the National Council on Radiation Protection recently issued commentary C9 in 2020 that addresses the occurrence of norm in the oil and gas industry.
And have you also reviewed the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Noble and Ms. Murphy?
Yes, I have.
What is your understanding of Mr. Noble's rebuttal testimony?
Mr. Noble discusses 3 incidents that occurred in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states.
And what is your response to that testimony?
I believe those examples are the result of a failure of the operators to comply with the existing rules.
And in your review of Ms. Murphy's testimony, you looked at in her exhibit 178 at pages 15 to 16, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And what is your understanding of Ms. Murphy's testimony there?
Like Mr. Noble, Ms. Murphy relies on studies performed in Pennsylvania.
And what is your response to their testimony about Pennsylvania?
The radium levels in Pennsylvania are order of magnitudes higher than those encountered in New Mexico.
Mr. Noble alleged in his testimony yesterday, he testified about a written safety policy and procedure to an oil field worker. He said that worker responded that he had never seen that particular document, and upon showing the document to his fellow workers, they responded they had never seen the document. Mr. Noble further suggested this indicated a lack of environmental health and safety training for oil field workers. Do you recall Mr. Noble's testimony in this regard?
Yeah, I believe the document that Mr. Noble allegedly showed to a worker was a high-level policy document that provides the basis for company training plans. I would not have expected a field employee to have seen or read that document before. Normally, documents provided to field employees are a distillation of the type of document that Mr. Noble was discussing.
Again, in his testimony yesterday, Mr. Noble, in response to my question about radium in a nuclear power reactor, said he was not aware of any such emission. Do you agree with that?
Yes, Mr. Noble, I think, was generally correct. The fact is, nuclear reactors are not a source of radium emissions. However, radium effluents are associated with other industrial facilities. For instance, municipal treatment plants are an example. Ion exchange units are commonly used to remove radium to bring raw water into compliance with the EPA's 5 picocurie per liter drinking water standard. When the ion exchange units are backwashed, radium will be discharged to a holding pond or effluent tank and released to a river or stream when the effluent is less than 60 picocuries per liter.
Yesterday, Mr. Noble also said that disposal options for NORM are limited, expensive, and difficult. What is your opinion on that?
Low-level radioactive waste is defined and regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission under their regulatory standards. NORM is regulated by the individual states. Disposal of NORM is much less difficult and much less expensive than the disposal of low-level radioactive waste.
Mr. Noble also suggested that companies do not emphasize environmental or employee health and safety in the oil field or at plants where oil field NORM is processed for disposal. What is your experience in this regard?
My experience is different. I find oil and gas companies to be emphasizing safety. It's true that not all employees will comply with all the strict requirements, but that's not because the companies don't care or don't do their best to enforce safety standards.
Mr. Noble also suggested yesterday that companies that process and dispose of oil and gas NORM have a record of abandoning their facilities, leaving the facility contaminated with NORM and harming local individuals and the environment. What are your thoughts regarding that testimony?
While there are 2 facilities, one in West Virginia and one in Ohio, that have gone bankrupt and have been abandoned by their operators, that's not a common issue. Facilities in those states did result in the need for state-funded cleanup. To my knowledge, there's no such facilities in New Mexico. The New Mexico Radiation Control Bureau has requirements for financial assurance set out in 20.3.3.311 and 14.14.C, excuse me.
Mr. Noble also expressed his worry that OSHA, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, doesn't do its part to protect workers that encounter NORM in the oil and gas industry.
Once again, the New Mexico radiation protection rules address worker safety throughout. Section 20.3.10 is entitled Notices, Instructions, and Reports to Workers, Inspections. Specifically, that section specifically requires licensed entities, including oil and gas operators, to ensure proper instruction of workers, to provide for safe possession and use of radioactive material, and to protect workers' rights during agency inspections.
And what should companies be doing to protect their workers in the way of protective gear?
Oil and gas operators provide their workers not only with proper instruction, but when required, they provide protective safety equipment including respirators, PLD or OSL badges, if radiation levels indicate the need for such things, or radiation detectors and instructions on how to use those detectors.
Finally, to clarify, you're testifying only with respect to the presence of radioactivity in produced water, correct?
That's correct.
You are not offering any opinions as to treatment or discharge with respect to other constituents of produced water. Is that right?
Excuse me. That is correct.
And then we have one final slide. Could you please just summarize your conclusion for the commissioners?
There's no reason to prohibit the discharge of treated water due to naturally occurring radioactive material, as the existing technologies are adequate to remove radium so that it poses no hazard to any person or the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Jacoby. That concludes my questions for Mr. Jacoby. I'd like to move for admission of NMOGA exhibits numbers 12, 14, and 117.
Sorry, 12, 14, and 170. All right.
117.
117.
Yes.
Thank you. Are there any objections? I'll pause here for a moment in the event any other party objects. Oh, all right. 12, 14, and 117 are admitted. We're ready for questions from the commission. Ms. Shaheen, we're ready for questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So start on this side. Commissioner Vihel.
I have no questions.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Brinkert.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jacoby. So I'm straight. Right at the end, you said you're not offering any position on any other contaminants other than naturally occurring radioactive material.
That's correct.
Okay, so the statement then in one of your slides that says any contaminants in the produced water can be readily treated with existing technologies which render the water suitable for discharge to surface water or groundwater. That's not your statement.
Thank you for clarifying that. I meant any available technology to treat radioactive material. I wasn't talking about any other contaminant. Thank you.
And to be fair, that slide may be talking about NMOGA's position about all the.
Well, that's true. Thank you.
All right, so you have referenced one exhibit, exhibit 117. And I went and looked for that. What appears on our website is kind of a summary of data collection. And then I had to link to a website. Then I had to download the data.
That's correct.
Okay, so it's not a paper. Is that correct?
Pardon me?
It's not a paper. It's not a published paper. It's just data.
I think it's published data. It's available for people to view.
But it's not a paper in the
Not
sense that someone's
peer-reviewed.
analyzing data and it's been peer reviewed and all that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it's okay. I thought maybe I was missing something as I bounced around the
That's
internet.
right. I should have referred to it as a data set, maybe.
It's a data set. That's what it is. Okay, and there appeared to be about, I saw when I went through the data, about 10 or so samples of radium.
Probably more than that. I think if you scroll from to the
10 or
right,
12,
there's
yeah.
more.
226 and 228. And so in your slides, you reference that the regulatory limit is what, 60 picocuries per liter?
That is the limit for releasing to surface waters or groundwater.
Okay. And so looking at this data, all the way you get to the right of the screen, they add them all up and create a mean and whatever. And you probably don't have it in front of you, but I saw the mean as 237.64 picocuries per liter. these samples?
Pico 237
Yeah.
picocuries per liter. In the waste or in the environment, if you will,
Right, so that's
not the release limit.
that's almost 4 times the limit.
Yes, I would need to get that paper in front of me. I don't think they're discussing the release limit. I think they're discussing what was in the water sample when they took it.
Right.
It's not unusual to have higher.
But if you release that to the environment, then you would be above the limit,
Perhaps,
untreated.
perhaps I'd have to go back and look at the data set.
And so it's your position then that there are treatments that can reduce that number down to below 60.
Oh, absolutely.
Gentlemen, just be sure not to talk over one another.
Okay, we're getting excited here.
I apologize.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Commissioner Bayless, do you have questions? You do not. Chair Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony and thank you, Mr. Commissioner Brankert, for the excitement. I have several questions. So the only data that you presented on the radioactive constituents in produce water is from that paper by Zhang et al. It was published in the Journal of Hazardous Materials.
Actually, I reviewed several papers. That one's jumped out at me because I didn't see it in Mrs. Murphy's testimony. That was
Yeah.
the only reason I listed that one specifically.
And in my opinion, it's an excellent paper. But there is, so my question of your testimony is, there are, I think, 46 analyses in that paper. And you're aware of other analyses of RADs in produced water, Permian Basin produced water, that you're basing your testimony on, but they're not cited in your testimony.
I have reviewed other papers on produced water in the Permian Basin in particular because there's a lot of research going on in Texas in that regard. I have to say I reviewed them. They're not published. They haven't been peer reviewed, so I didn't cite them in my testimony.
I can cut to the chase. My question is, are the data reported by Zhang et al. Representative of the information you've seen?
I think they're on the lower end, but I believe that they do represent those samples that were taken, those 46 plus
46.
samples. I think there's another paper where I think it was Dr. Who reported 469 picocuries per liter on the average.
Yes. For radium-226, they're reporting an average of 237, a max of 976, and a min of near zero. So, but we're not going to be surprised with numbers like they're reporting out of the Marcellus of many thousands.
I would be surprised in the Permian. Marcellus is the highest in the nation. And if I was producing oil and gas in New Mexico and I was writing rules to protect the public, I wouldn't think there's going to be 20,000 picocuries per liter in produced water.
Thank you. We've heard public expressions of concern about plutonium, polonium, thorium. I'm looking at Dr. Zhang's data. Here they got U-238, a mean of 0.17 picocuries per liter, a max of 0.17, and a minimum of 0.17, which implies to me that there's only one sample that tested positive for 238, uranium-238. Similarly, they reported the same numbers for plutonium-238, 0.17 picocuries per liter. Again, apparently only one analysis because there's no statistics.
Did you say plutonium-238?
Plutonium-238.
That's not norm. It's unusual to see that in a sample.
Would you expect it in produce water?
I would not. It may be a contaminant from weapons testing or something, but
In produce water?
I can't imagine where else it would come from. It's just not a naturally occurring radioactive material.
No, it's not. Could it possibly be
Maybe it's a
lab error?
typo. It would be uranium-238. I was just saying, maybe it's plutonium-238. Maybe that should have been uranium-238. I don't know.
I wonder if it could be a laboratory error.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It's an error.
Yeah, and I'm just focusing on that because the public has expressed concerns about constituents that you really wouldn't expect to see. That being a classic example. Can you describe, excuse me, can you describe the regulatory exemptions for radioactive materials in oil and gas waste?
Well, the exemptions are set out in the radiation protection rules. And, I don't have those in front of me, but and I'm kind of reluctant to state them from memory, but normally it's about 30 picocuries per gram, I think that's not correct. 5 picocuries per gram is exempt. That's a high level for soil. And like I said, 5 picocuries per liter for drinking water, 60 picocuries per liter to be discharged to rivers. And if I may, while you're talking about that, I've been here for a couple of days, and I hear a lot of confusion, I think, about the drinking water limit. That is not the limit for radium in water that's not meant to be drinking water. River water or surface impoundments can have higher levels of radium in the groundwater. It's when you take it out of the river or out of the lake and you send it to the public to drink that water, it can't be any greater than 5 picocuries per liter.
Thank you. And that was one of the misunderstandings I was hoping we could clear up a little bit. So I appreciate that. But there's also an exemption. Mr. Noble testified that there's an exemption, I think under Atomic Energy Act or NRC regulations for oil and gas. Are you aware of that?
Oh, there's something called the Bevel Amendment that says
Yes.
yes, and that says that oil and gas regulation is exempt from Environmental Protection Agency regulations.
They're completely exempt.
And I think it relates primarily to the RCRA side of the house. Although at the national level, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does not regulate NORM. NORM is regulated by the states, including NORM in produced water.
Yes. Thank you. Do they also?
Let me clarify that.
Please.
NORM resulting from produced water. If you produce water with radioactivity in it, and then you contaminate a land surface or a building or something else, that is regulated. Water itself is not.
And then if you concentrate the norm by a treatment process, exchange or reverse osmosis or something,
Correct.
that then becomes T norm. Is that correct?
That is regulated.
And identify T norm for the record.
I'm glad you brought that up. NORM is naturally occurring radioactive material. In the business, there's something called T-norm, which is technologically enhanced, naturally occurring radioactive material. Any process that increases the amount or changes the character of naturally occurring norm would be called technologically enhanced norm.
Thank you. So if a company constructed a treatment process to desalinate the produce water, let's say it's reverse osmosis, and they would generate residual requiring disposal. And Dr. Van Gogh talked about it quite a bit. Mr. Noble talked about it as well. The residuals from the treatment. And that would almost certainly contain both the radioactive constituents, but it would also contain some of the hazardous constituents like arsenic, iron, manganese, sulfate, whatever. And how would the industry handle that concentrated waste?
Well, I'm not here to talk about anything other than radioactive material, but I work on a lot of uranium mines where they use reverse osmosis to clean up water before they return it to the field. I've also worked on municipal water supplies where they use ion exchangers to produce water less than 5 picocuries per liter so people can drink it. With respect to reverse osmosis, as you know, the membrane traps, if you will, some of the hazardous constituents and lets clean water flow through. What you do is you flush the RO system. Usually about 25% of the water will be flushed off to an effluent stream, and that'll go to a disposal well. And then, of course, the clean water goes forward. If that single RO unit doesn't clean the water adequately, you can have RO units in a train, one right after the other to get to the radium concept, the radioactive concentration down below where you want it. Same thing with ion exchange units. You can do the same. You can put ion exchange units in series to reduce the water to the level that you're looking for.
So it would be multiple stages, which is real common for for many treatment processes, which are treating highly contaminated solutions.
It is. Most of the municipal treatment systems I've worked on use 4 ion exchangers.
Yes. So my question is, the concentrate from that treatment process, can that be disposed of in a saltwater disposal well?
No. It's an interesting question, but I think not, because it would no longer be produced water. It would be effluents from a treatment system. That would be either a water treatment system or in a uranium mine. You're dealing with produced water to begin with.
It would
I'm sorry.
the concentrate from a treatment process would be considered T-norm, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I was just thinking if you wanted to take produced water and clean it up, turn it into municipal drinking water, I think the effluent stream would be T-norm. I think that's correct.
But it would
have to
also
think about that one.
Yeah. And then it would also have high concentrations of hazardous metals like arsenic.
It could.
So would it then be classified as a mixed waste?
Not normally. If the chemicals are naturally occurring and the radioactivity is naturally occurring, it's not really considered mixed waste. At least in a uranium mine, for instance, it goes down a disposal well. Nobody calls it mixed waste.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Dominguez.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Thank you, Mr. Jacoby, for your testimony today. I just have a couple of follow-up questions. In your rebuttal testimony for Mr. Noble, you referred to some of his testimony about OSHA and impact to workers in the oil fields or other places. So with that foundation, and I don't know if you heard Mr. Noble's testimony, but in response to some of the questioning, he suggested or recommended that the WQCC insert safety standards for workers within this proposed rule. Are you aware if the WQCC has authority over worker safety?
The NMED, Bureau of Radiation Control, I think it is, has responsibility for worker safety. The primary responsibility for worker safety lies with the oil and gas company. The Bureau of Radiation Control standards in the state of New Mexico set the standards for what you must do and how you must provide a radiation safety program, and specifically speaks to oil and gas operations in 20.3.14. So I'd say the licensee has primary responsibility, and the Bureau of Radiation Control inspects to make sure they carry out their responsibilities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jacoby. That concludes my question.
Thank you. Vice Chair Armstrong.
No questions from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Patton.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I have a couple of questions. Following up on Chair Thompson's questions related to, I think it was referred to as T-norm, or the whatever it is you would pull out of treated water. How would you dispose of that at a facility?
Well, in a municipal water supply situation, for instance, if you take raw water, you run it through an ion exchanger, it removes the radium. It's the purpose of the ion exchanger. Every now and then you have to backwash the ion exchanger to take the radium out. That goes to a holding tank, and the radium will go with it to the holding tank. After a while, you can remove the water from that holding tank because the radium sediments will fall to the bottom. You can take those out with a vac truck or something, suck them out, dewater those solids, if you will, send those to a disposal site. There are disposal sites in Texas that can take that type of waste. New Mexico is in the Rocky Mountain Compact, so NORM has to go to a disposal site in Colorado, for instance. But there are disposal sites that take those waste products. If the water going through the surge tank is not clean enough, at least on one project I worked on, there was a settling pond where the water would go and settle, or, sit there. The solids would settle to the bottom of the pond. The clean water below 60 picocuries per liter could then be discharged to a river. Every now and then, and of course, you sample, right, to see what the radiation levels are. When they get too high, or when you just think you need to do work on the settling pond or on the surge tank, you can take the sediments out, dewater them, ship them for disposal.
Okay. Okay, and then we've heard a lot of testimony from the public expressing concerns about, and I'm going to limit it just to NORM in this case, a certain concentration. If someone were to purchase that treated produced water and use it for irrigation or something like that, it could persist in the environment. I haven't really heard anything about the half-life of NORM or radium 226 or 228. So how long would it persist? Let's say an individual were to have a farm and they were to use that treated produced water for a certain amount of time. is that something that could persist there for a long time or short term?
Well, radium 226 has a half-life of 5,200 years, so it sticks around for a while.
I'm sorry,
5,000 years.
5,000 years.
Sticks
Okay.
5,200 years, I believe. Here's the deal, though. Under the regulations of the Radiation Control Bureau in New Mexico and in other states, anytime you have a well for whatever purpose, oil and gas production, water production, uranium mining, class 3 injection well of any sort, you have to survey when you decommission that facility. And if anything on the ground is greater than 5 picocuries per liter, you have to clean it up. The existing rules do not allow you to just leave that on the ground. And you can clean it up by, you can either plow it in the ground. The rule, another rule that hasn't been talked about here is the 5 picocuries per liter rule for 5 picocuries per gram for soil. That's in the first 6 inches or 15 centimeters of the surface of the ground. Below that 15 centimeters, and every 15 centimeters below that, it could be 15 picocuries per gram. It's called the 5-15 rule. So what a lot of companies will do is you survey, and if you see hot spots, you go out, you plow that ground, and you turn the soil over so that the surface is less than 5. And if you do that, you can release it for unrestricted use.
And that would be for a treatment facility, but not necessarily the source or the final destination of that treated produced water.
That can be the source of where it was generated. If it's at the well site, when you decommission the well, you survey around to make sure you haven't contaminated the surface. You plow it, you can excavate it, dig it up, put it in drums, ship it for disposal if you want to. But if you can plow it and turn the surface in the first 15 centimeters to less than 5 picocuries per gram, that meets the rules. And that's based on analyses done to show that below 5 picocuries per gram, there is no significant hazard to cattle, to people, to anybody.
Okay. I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fry.
I have no questions. Thank you.
All right, go to the platform, Commissioner Rosatos.
Madam Hearing Officer, I don't have anything. Thank you.
Thank you, and Commissioner McWilliams.
I have no questions.
All right, thank you. Let's turn then to questioning by the parties. Mr. Maxwell, do you have questions of the witness?
Your Honor, I have no questions for this witness.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jacoby. I'm Liz Taylor. I represent Select Water Solutions in this proceeding. I got lost in the science between you and Chair Thompson about RO and what you do with the resulting products. So I just want to ask a couple questions about that. So let's say that you have, and I think you addressed it with Commissioner Patton concerning municipal wastewater treatment, where you take the radium through RO and what you do with that. But for produced water, if you have a recycling facility that removes the radium, you've got sort of within, as I understand it from testimony earlier, that when you treat produced water, you end up with a clean water source or clean water part, and then a wastewater part. Is that fair understanding of what's going on?
In a processing facility?
Yes, sir.
You can. That's one thing that does happen.
Okay, so the water that has been cleaned goes on to its other use, whatever that might be. And I just want to talk about what I'm going to call the waste stream that comes after processing, recycling, treating produced water. And it has radium in it, and it has concentrated radium in it because that's the point of the treatment, is to concentrate the contaminants in a waste stream, right?
That's the result of the processing, yes.
Okay. Then for that waste stream, what happens to it?
Well, if it's dilute enough, you can put it down a disposal well into a salt cavern, for instance. There's a lot of disposal wells in Texas that do that very thing.
Or just when you say it's dilute enough, what's the level that's dilute enough?
If it's going into a salt cavern, I don't think there's any particular high upper limit. I presume the lower limit might be 5 picocuries per liter, but I don't know why you would send produced water for treatment if it was at that level anyway.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I just couldn't hear it.
So if you send water to a processing facility, as you say, the clean water goes off, that could be some limit, 5 picocuries per liter. The residual water that you have, the wastewater, in a lot of these facilities, it simply goes down a disposal well. It doesn't get further treatment for further release. If it's full of a lot of solids and a little bit of water, they'll treat that waste to drive off the water, if you will, convert it into a solid, and then dispose of it in a disposal site of some sort.
Go ahead.
Most produced water treatment now goes down into a disposal well. There's not many landfills that accept oil and gas norm.
So does, and again, I'm got a little lost in the science, but would that residual water include what you call T norm?
I wouldn't call it T norm. I think it'd be norm.
So it can go in a saltwater disposal well?
I'm sorry.
So it can be disposed of in a saltwater disposal well?
Yes. At least in Texas, for sure.
Do you know about New Mexico?
I don't know about New Mexico.
Would you expect it to be similar?
I think it probably would be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cox?
No questions for this witness. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see Mr. Hightower. He may have exited. Mr. Davis?
Hi, Mr. Jacoby. My name is Tim Davis. I represent Wild Earth Guardians in this matter. And I wanted to focus on page 6 of your rebuttal. That's NMOGA 000166.
Papers here. I need to- Okay, we have it here now.
Specifically on line 104 through 106, you testified about the resulting wastewater stream could be injected to an underground formation and the resulting solids sent to a suitable facility for disposal. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you've actually been testifying over the last several minutes in response to questions from the commission and the parties about the waste stream. So when I refer to the waste stream, we're talking about what is not the treated effluent. Is that correct?
What is not?
Sorry, let me rephrase the question. I just want to make sure when I'm talking about the waste stream that you and I are talking about the same thing. This is what is left over from the raw water that is not the treated water. Does that make sense?
The raw water prior to treatment.
So you start with raw, produced water and you resulted with treated produced water, and then there's a separate waste stream. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're a lawyer, correct? Are you familiar with the body of law that we would call hazardous waste law?
With respect to radioactivity, I am. Yes.
And I believe in response to a question from the chair earlier, you referenced RCRA.
I presume I did.
Can you tell me what RCRA is?
Source conservation.
And that law is the federal law that defines what gets classified as a hazardous waste.
That's correct.
And that law governs the disposal of hazardous waste, among other things, but it does govern how hazardous waste is disposed of.
That's correct.
Do you agree that this proposed rule cannot govern how a waste stream would be disposed of if it classifies as a hazardous waste under RCRA?
I'm not sure I understand you fully, but I don't believe that's correct.
I believe you testified earlier in response to a question from the chair that once treated, the concentrated waste stream is no longer produced water. Is that a fair statement of your earlier testimony?
If I understand you correctly, I think that's correct.
So if it's no longer produced water, it could be classified as hazardous waste under RCRA.
Coming out of a processing plant, maybe so. But I think you're raising an interesting point here because in Texas, radioactive material that is below the exemption limit, below at least 30 picocuries per gram in Texas, goes to a RCRA disposal cell because it's not radioactive, but it is hazardous. So it's allowed to go to a RCRA disposal cell above 30 pics per gram. Usually they send it down a byproduct disposal well or a low-level waste disposal site.
So you would agree that the waste stream from treating produced water could be subject to RCRA?
It is not normally subject to RCRA, but if you're looking for a disposal option and there is no other option, if you can get it below exempt levels, so it's not considered radioactive under the, at least in New Mexico, 20.3.14, it could go to a RCRA cell. Doesn't have to, it can go to a low-level waste cell.
Are you familiar with the oil and gas exploration and production exemption, also known as the E&P exemption to RCRA?
I am.
Do you agree that this proposed rule does not determine whether a certain waste is subject to that exemption?
If it's E&P waste, it is subject to the exemption.
Do you agree that this rule cannot make that determination? This proposed rule would not determine whether a waste is subject to the E&P exemption.
I really would have to go back and read the rule again a little closer and think about it from that viewpoint because I fear I would give you a wrong answer if I answered it off the top of my head.
Would you agree that RCRA would determine whether a waste is subject to the E&P exemption and the body of case law and regulations that are associated with RCRA?
Well, the Bevel Amendment, I think, determines that.
So this rule would not be determinative. This proposed rule or any rule promulgated by the WQCC could not make a determination whether a waste is subject to the EMP exemption.
Like I said, I'd have to spend some time thinking about that. I hate to answer that off the top of my head because I could be wrong. Could be right, but I could be wrong.
Is it your position that a rule promulgated into the New Mexico Administrative Code could supersede the provisions of RCRA?
I think not. But what I really would need to know what you're talking about in terms of the waste stream, how you propose to dispose of it, and I need a lot more technical data than to just answer that question very broadly.
Have you ever authored a peer review study?
Not recently, no.
But you have before?
I have before, earlier in my career.
Could you identify that for me, please?
Probably not. It's been 30, 40 years ago. I couldn't.
Have you ever been a consultant for Lotus LLC?
I have.
When was that?
I'm still a consultant for them.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. You're
I
currently.
still consult with Lotus LLC.
I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Davis, Ms. Nanasi. That's fine. Ms. Fox.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jacoby. My name is Anna Fox, and I represent Amigos Bravos and Sierra Club in this proceeding. Thank you for your testimony. In your written testimony and in your oral testimony today, you referred to Dr. Hu's testimony, his direct testimony, that produced water samples from the Permian Basin in a published article had a mean total radium concentration of 469.3 picocuries per liter, correct?
Correct.
And the article that you cited to in your testimony and actually referred to today is NMED Exhibit 140, entitled Characterization of Produced Water and Surrounding Surface Water in the Permian Basin, the United States, correct?
If that's the exhibit that was cited in, I think, Dr. Hu's testimony, then that's correct.
Do you want to check that and look on page
I really would like to check that.
10 on your testimony?
I'd like to see what that exhibit is. I don't know if I can find that quickly. Give me a
If you
second.
look on page 10 of your testimony, lines 189
Oh, good.
through 191.
Thank you. Yes, yes. So that's correct. On page, on 190, it refers to Exhibit 140. Thank you.
Let me give you this. This might be helpful to you. This is from page 4 of that article, NMED Exhibit 140, that I'm going to give to you.
Need to blow these articles up for an old man here.
For anyone. And I believe these numbers have already been referred to in questions from the commission, but the article states on page 4 that, quote, these results also show a large temporal variation between produced water samples from 2.56 to 576 picocuries per liter for radium-228, and from 0.74 to 970 picocuries per liter for radium-226 in sampling point 2. Do you recall that information from the article that you cited to?
Now I'm reading it. I see it here.
Water quality standards for radium are often expressed in terms of concentrations of radium-226 plus radium-228, correct?
That's correct.
Why is that?
Well, because the predominant of the radionuclide is radium-226, which has a much longer half-life. Radium-228 has a much shorter half-life. And the ratio or proportion of the two may tell you something about the aquifer or the formation where the radium came from.
And you point out in your written testimony, and you did today in your oral testimony, that the EPA drinking water standard for radium is 5 picocuries per liter, correct?
That's correct.
And that standard is for any combination of radium-226 and 228 in drinking water, correct?
That's correct.
5 picocuries per liter combined radium-226 and 228 is the standard in New Mexico for domestic water supply under the surface water quality standards and for the human health groundwater standard, correct?
Say that again. I'm sorry, for the
2 standards in New Mexico have 5 picocuries as the standard. One is in the surface water standards for domestic water supply, and the other in the groundwater quality standards for human health.
right. And like I said earlier, that is for the drinking water. That's the drinking water standard. That's not the standard for the raw water coming out of a stream or being pumped out of a well in the ground.
Are you not familiar with the surface water quality standards in New Mexico? I was referring to both the surface water quality standards and the groundwater quality standards. You may not be familiar with them.
Well, I'd like to read it in context because that's inconsistent with EPA standards, if that's the case.
The standard for domestic water supply under the surface water quality standards is at 20.6.4 900J1 NMAC is the context.
Well, I haven't, like I said, I like to read it myself
Okay,
and think it through because that is inconsistent with the EPA standard. If that's the case, I suspect there's got to be more to that puts it in context.
Okay, so you just don't know the answer. That's fine.
No, it's not that I'm not answering it. It's that
No, I said you don't know the answer. I didn't say you weren't answering.
Thank you.
Now, in your written testimony, And in your oral testimony today, you referred to NMOGA Exhibit 117, which is the data set associated with NMED Exhibit 140 that we've talked about, correct?
Right.
And your testimony on page 7, you cite to the web page, and we've talked about the related data already. You cite to the web page with related data.
One second.
Sure.
On
Page 7. Lines 133 and 134. You there?
Yes.
There you cite to a web page with related data underlying the sampling of the produced water that was done in the Permian, correct? Specifically, I'm referring to line 134.
Are you referring to the link there? The link?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
On line 134. Okay, so I passed out and I put in the Dropbox what's marked as Exhibit ABSC, Exhibit 18, which is part of the data set that you cited to.
That's correct.
And you see in that exhibit the highlighted portions showing that from sample 12. I believe you said that there were either said 10 or 12 samples during a presentation or during response to a question, showing that sample 12 from sampling point 2 detected 970 picocuries per liter of radium-226 and 576 picocuries per liter of radium-228.
That's correct.
And those two numbers are consistent with what's reported in the article NMED 140 itself, correct?
I believe they are, yes.
And because those detections come from the same sample, you would add them together to get total radium, correct?
That's correct.
In your rebuttal testimony to Dr. Lewis's testimony on page 6 at the beginning, lines 92 through 98.
Yes.
And again, this is in rebuttal to Dr. Lewis's testimony. You're asked, what is NMOGA's position on the presence of naturally occurring radioactive material in produced water? And you respond that NMOGA opposes a regulatory prohibition on the discharge of untreated or treated produced water to surface or groundwater because any contaminants in the produced water, including NORM, can be readily treated with existing technologies which render the water suitable for discharge to surface water or groundwater, correct?
Correct.
And that is NMOGA's position. It's not yours because, as you discussed with Commissioner Brankard, you're not rendering any opinion. And as you said yourself, you're not rendering any opinion on the treatment of contaminants other than NORM, correct?
That's correct.
And so on the next page, page 7, when you say, you're asked rather at line 117, what is your recommendation to the WQCC? And you say the proposed Rule 8 should be amended to permit the discharge of produced water to surface water or groundwater following treatment as necessary to reduce contaminants, including NORM, to acceptable levels, correct?
That's what it says, yes.
And again, you don't offer any opinion whatsoever on what treatment is necessary to reduce the other contaminants.
That's correct. I'm here to talk about radioactive material.
Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Fox. Let's see, Ms. Anasi. Oh, yes.
It's not all I have because I'd like to move to introduce ABSC Exhibit 18.
18.
And can I object?
I'm sorry.
Your Honor, I object to.
Okay. I, excuse me, Commissioner Brankert, I didn't hear what you said. I was about to pause for a moment to see if there was any objection. Did you have something to
And I
say?
jumped in and said, can I object?
Can you object? All right. First, let me ask the parties first. Mr. Maxwell, what's the basis for your objection?
Yes, I object to the entrance of this exhibit as it has not been provided to me pursuant to the rulemaking process of subsection 302A in the rules for this proceeding. And simply putting it into the Dropbox is insufficient as parties are not notified of this. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Any other party objections? Commissioner Brankert, tell me your objection.
Well, I believe this is the data set from exhibit that you get to through exhibit 117. Is that correct?
Correct. And the citation for that data set is in Mr. Jacoby's testimony. He cites to the data set. He gives the link for that data set.
Right. But this is not the data set.
It is part of the
It's
data
just a
set.
snapshot of part of data set.
It is part of the data set. He affirmed it was part of the data set.
Right. But you're missing the entire next part of this page, which is what I was citing from, which when you get to it gives you minimum, maximum, mean, etc. for all these.
Well, two responses to that. I'm not sure that's correct, but if it is, I'd be glad to supplement with the complete data set from that particular Excel spreadsheet.
That would be helpful. Otherwise, I think this is somewhat misleading.
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Maxwell, in response to your objection, the information is already in the record because it was part of the data set that NMOGA already has. What Ms. Fox has done for the purposes of a cross-examination exhibit is to take one snapshot from the data set that's already in the record. So the objection is overruled, conditional on Ms. Fox providing the remainder of the snapshot.
Sure. And I would just like to point out, as I already have, but for purposes of for exhibits for cross-examination, no notice is required. We are allowed to pass them out at the time of hearing. The functional equivalent of that for parties who are appearing virtually and not in person is to drop them in the Dropbox. There's no prejudice to Mr. Maxwell because he gets it in the Dropbox versus me passing it out to counsel here.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Fox. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. Thank you, Commissioner Brankert. I'm sorry? Yes. Ms. Anasi. Why is that? Well, okay. So we're all exhausted, Ms. Anasi. I trust that you had some understanding of Mr. Jacoby's testimony since his rebuttal was pre-filed, and that. Oh yeah, you need to get to a microphone.
I absolutely have had Mr. Jacoby's rebuttal for a while. The issue is that we were told a completely different order for the NMOGA witnesses, which I was thinking that was going to go with Mr. McCurdy next. And so I'm completely prepared for Mr. McCurdy and not as prepared for Mr. Jacoby. And we also started with Mr. D'Antonio and then stopped. And we also thought he was going to go before Mr. Jacoby. And so I'm just asking for that. It's after 5 o'clock. Wanted to know if we can start tomorrow morning. I'm happy to be ready by then.
So I understand. Hold on, let me ask Mr. Knight one question. Mr. Knight, would you have questions of Mr. Jacoby? He said that I do. So, Ms. Anasi, I'm going to take Mr. Knight first, and I would just encourage you to center yourself for examination. Mr. Knight, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer, members of the commission, Mr. Jacoby, good evening. I believe you may know who I am from from being here today.
I do.
Dispense with introductions and just go right into it. The reference to limits that you had on your PowerPoint presentation illustrated effluent limits for radium, correct?
Correct.
To clarify, the regulation that you cited these limits from are the standards for protection against radiation as adopted through the Environmental Improvement Board. Is that right?
That's right.
And they're not the state's surface water quality standards or the ground and surface water quality protection regulations as adopted by this commission, correct? Those effluent limits
As adopted by this commission, the standards I cited are in the New Mexico Administrative Code, 20.3.14.461, I think. It sets out the limits, and I may have the right citation. I hope I do, but that is the effluent limits for radium-226. That's cited in the rules for oil and gas, regulating oil and gas operations in New Mexico.
and radiation protection rules are not surface water quality standards, correct?
The standards I cited those are the effluent limits. That is what you can discharge to a surface water body.
And they are not groundwater quality standards, correct?
I think I would have to agree with that.
The RCB regulations that you cited apply by their terms only to operations within the oil and gas industry. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So those regulations.
Well, wait a minute. That is not correct. That standard, I think, is in 20.3.3.416. It's in a different section of the rules. The section that applies to the oil and gas industry is 20.3.14, I believe, but it references the rules in a different section. And I think those standards apply to all licensees and are consistent with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission effluent limits.
All right. Let's see. And for clarification, the exemption for produced water that you mentioned is an exemption under RCRA subsection C. Is that correct?
Sorry, say that again.
The exemption for produced water that you mentioned in your testimony is an exemption under RCRA subsection C. Is that correct?
At the federal level, but at the state level, there's a specific rule in your administrative code that says produced water is exempt from regulation by the Bureau of Red Control.
You stated that the average exposure of radiation is 620 millirem per year. Is that the right number?
Yeah, I think that's correct. It comes from the International Commission on Radiation Protection.
But that is of an average person, correct?
That's an average.
And while this is sometimes referred to as background, isn't it true that something like 1/2 of that exposure comes from man-made sources?
That's correct.
Wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that workers with exposure to materials containing radium over working 40 hours a week all year would be exposed to higher doses than that?
Perhaps it really would depend on the level of radium in the facility where they're working, how close they are to the source of the radioactivity, and a lot of other factors.
And isn't it true that people living at higher elevations, such as in New Mexico, that that typically increases radiation exposure, in some cases up to 20 times that at sea level?
That's correct.
Is radiation exposure good for human health?
That is debated constantly. There are some people that believe that a little bit of radiation is good for you. Others believe it's, as Mr. Noble does, that it's extremely detrimental. On the average, these rules are meant to set limits for proper exposure levels for humans, for people.
I think that's all the questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Knight. Ms. Nasi.
People usually tell me to be quiet.
Charger. Yes. No, I Good afternoon, Mr. Jacoby. Who were you a registered lobbyist for?
I was a registered lobbyist in Texas for Lotus LLC and also for waste control specialists.
For what? What was the
Waste,
second one?
waste control specialists. They're a company in Texas that disposes of radioactive waste. I was also a registered lobbyist for Lotus LLC. I'm not currently registered.
There's no peer-reviewed study that is listed in your resume, is that right?
That's correct.
Other than the Jang et al. Report cited in your testimony, are there any other peer-reviewed articles that you rely on?
You know, I read dozens of papers and articles in preparing for this testimony. I did not commit them to memory.
But they're not cited in your testimony, right?
No.
And if you could look at excuse me for 1 second, please. Just one moment.
And while you're doing that, I want to correct something. The last session of the Texas legislature, I was also registered as a lobbyist for Encore Energy. I had forgotten about that.
Could you go to here it is, page 14, and this is where you begin criticizing Mr. Noble's testimony. And one of the criticisms you say is that in the last 4 decades since those reports, and those were published, some of them were peer-reviewed reports, some of them were just industry reports. The oil and gas industry has conducted a huge amount of research on produced water, which you say that you're not testifying about, right? You're just testifying about norm in produced water, correct?
That's correct. But
So-
wait a minute, let me see. You're reading 287 to 289?
Yes, sir, but I haven't finished that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure.
Okay,
that-
sure, please.
That it's not focused just on. Okay, thank you.
And develop new technologies or adapted old technologies to address the issue of contaminants in produced water, including radium. When you say here that there's a huge amount of research to defend your position regarding norm in produced water, could you please state one peer-reviewed article that you're referring to?
I don't know if I can cite it by its exact title, but there are a number of peer-reviewed papers out there, recent papers. Here's the thing. Let me back up. 100 years ago, they identified norm in oil. They did some research. They did some investigations. It went on for a while. In the last 15 or 20 years, it's become quite an issue. And there's a lot of papers that have been published addressing that, some peer-reviewed, some not. The International Commission on Radiation Protection has done research into this and written articles. The National Commission on Radiation Protection likewise has published papers on norm in the oil and gas industry. The Health Physics Society, there's a number of articles that I happened to look at the other day. I didn't look to see if they were all peer-reviewed or not. Normally they are if they go into the Health Physics Journal. In fact, I think they all are. One was by Dave Allard, who was the radiation control officer in Pennsylvania for a long time, who did extensive research on norm in the Marcellus. There were some others that I didn't commit to memory, and I didn't really look to see if they were peer-reviewed, but I bet they were, to be honest with you, or they would have been published in the journal.
So you're asking this commission, you're a lawyer, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You're asking this commission to rely on your expert testimony based on one article, one peer-reviewed article that says that there's norm that's been found in Permian Basin, in the Permian Basin produced water. Is that right?
That's not right.
It's not right?
I'm here today to talk about radium in produced water generally, based on my own experience, based on articles I've reviewed, based on regulations I've read.
But there's
It's
nothing
certainly-
in your testimony.
Excuse me, it's certainly more than one paper.
But there's nothing in your testimony, right?
There is not a reference to peer-reviewed papers, but I can assure you a lot of research went into this.
And you heard Mr. Noble, you heard Dr. Van Gogh, and both of them not only cited but then presented it before this commission numerous exhibits. I think Dr. Van Gogh talked about 34 peer-reviewed published articles about produced water. Is that right? Do you remember that?
I didn't hear that, but I know Dr. Van Gush, and I have respect for the gentleman.
Because he's world renowned, right?
Pardon me.
Because he's world renowned.
I don't know if he's world renowned, but I've had conversations with him, and I think he's a good scientist.
Madam Hearing Officer, can I ask Ms. Jones to pull up an exhibit that I sent to her and that was discussed? It was in Dropbox also, and I would like to talk to Mr. Jacoby about, and that is New Energy Economy 23. Okay.
This is one of Mr. Noble's articles, I believe, was published in a newspaper.
Into the
Journal,
microphone,
so
please.
not a journal. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Could you please pull up that picture that's in this exhibit on the front first page? This is the company, Lotus LLC, that you've been a consultant for. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
And in this article, what's this article about? You're quoted in this article. Is that right?
It might be. I don't know.
Do you know about this article?
I've read the article a long time ago, but I didn't commit it to memory.
Do you know that it accuses Lotus LLC of receiving radioactive waste and then it just being piled up here in the picture that's shown in this image without having properly stored that radioactive material, including that the containers are basically falling apart and rusting and leaking into the earth.
That you've overstated a lot of that. First thing I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is if you can show me where I'm quoted in this article, so I can.
Sure.
Because I don't remember with this.
I think it's close to the end. It's basically the last full page of the article. And it's the fourth and third paragraph from the end.
Nice, I see it.
Right.
Are you studying it? I see a lot of.
Yeah.
I do a lot of consulting.
Yes.
Okay.
You want to read that?
Yeah, let me refresh my memory. So it's just those two paragraphs you're referring to.
Those are the two paragraphs that your name appears. Yes.
Right. Thank you. That's correct.
And so what does Lotus LLC do?
Lotus LLC receives waste from the oil industry, cleans vessels, cleans pipes, valves, takes the waste and deposits it downhole into salt caverns.
And it also stores waste, is that right?
It does what?
Stores radioactive waste?
It does not.
It doesn't?
No.
And
The vessels that you see there are going to be decontaminated. That waste is going to be put downhole. That's why they're there.
Would you look at, Ms. Jones, could we go to it's a couple of pages from the top of this, and
It's the same articles you're talking about.
I didn't hear what you said.
It's the same articles. That we,
Yes, please. Okay. Okay. Gosh, I always forget. We'll begin at 9 with public comment, and then we will go back to Ms. Nanasi's questioning of Mr. Jacoby. I'm sorry for the interruption.